So wheeling season is upon us, and although I don't think I do like extreme wheeling, the Samurai front axle probably thinks we do. I think it's time to rebuild it. Yeah, time has been flying. We've actually built the Samurai axle 2 years ago now. So this front axle's been through a lot. I have not really cracked it open even once now that I think of it, because everything's just been working great. But 2 seasons of wheeling on it. You know, they kind of say the rule of thumb for Toyota, Dana 44, Samurai axles. You can't remember the last time you rebuilt it, it's time to do it. Some people say every 2 years, some every 1 year. Well, it's been 2 years for us, and I really just don't feel like I've been beating it that hard. So kind of want to see what it looks like. And it's been 2 years. It's time to tear it open. So we got a rebuild kit. We're going to see where we're at with it. I'm going to give you guys pretty much the short version of me just rebuilding the whole front axle. I remember the first time it being pretty easy, and this rebuild should be pretty easy. So the wheeling season's starting. You got to rebuild your front axle too. So come check out how I do it. It's really easy, and we'll get on the trail soon. So definitely want to get some jacks you can depend on to be under here. These are Harbor Freight ones, but they've always been pretty solid for me. So here I'm just starting to take apart the hub, and I'm already finding a little bit of rust residue in here, and these are just a little bit tighter than I remember. But like usual, and with everything else, it's a lot easier to tear these apart than put them back together. So this part goes pretty fast. You just kind of want to keep everything organized so you don't get anything mixed up, and it goes back together a lot smoother. This is the axle nut remover socket that I got from Low Range Off-Road. Could probably get one on Amazon too, but it was just really easy to order it through them because they had some other parts I needed too. But like I said, this all comes off pretty easy. The longest part is going to be scraping this seal off of the hub there. I mean, there's a lot of residue left over for that. I like to use these dead blow hammers to kind of hit the spindle from a different direction each time, and finally it'll just come off. It's really just all that RTB that's holding it on there. Same thing with these little kingpins. You kind of just hit them with the dead blow. They'll finally come out. Just be careful to not drop this knuckle all the way off when you do that. With enough persuasion, this axle shaft will just kind of slide out, and you can see the condition it's in. Mine was in pretty good condition. All the splines looked great. We knock out that axle seal real quick. Comes right out when you have the right tool. I find for getting these tie rod ends out, if you hit them from the side on the arm, they come out a lot easier, and also helps if you put some anti-seize on them before you put them back in. Taking this seal and pad off the knuckle, we're getting really close down to it. And these races for the trunnion are extremely difficult to get out. Don't be surprised, and don't be down on yourself if you have a hard time getting them out. It literally took me probably 10 to 15 minutes to get each one out because there's not a big lip to really get a grip on. So, you know, just be careful, take your time, and get those out. All right, so throw on the new pad, throw on the new seal, just make sure they're going the right way. And then I use the old race to start tapping these in with the brass hammer. And then once they're in far enough, you don't really need to use the race anymore. And then they just go down and make sure they're seated all the way. I do the same thing with the opposite end. The important thing here is to make sure you're keeping your bearings and races together. Don't mix them up. Keep them with the one they came with in the package. That way they're just gonna last longer. So throwing some lube back on the seal so the axle shaft goes in a lot easier, and you kind of just have to wiggle these around and twist the axle, and then finally you'll see it just pops in. So it takes a minute to do it, but you'll figure it out. Greasing up these bearings is probably one of the most important parts. You see, I've got some grease in my hand. I'm just scooping it in. You'll see some people put the grease in the cage like that, and then they kind of just go for it. I like to move the bearing upside down and get it all in from the top too. Like, the goal is really just to put a ton of grease on this, so no matter which way it spins, it's got grease on it. Once you got them in top and bottom, you can put the knuckle on. And then it's time to clean off and put these kingpins back in there, and you kind of just wiggle them around until they're sitting in those bearings. You know, this isn't something that should take a lot of force. They should just go right in. Then we can start throwing our bolts in, and with most of this stuff on a Samurai front axle, they are low torque settings. So make sure you get the right reading on this and use the right torque wrench. You don't want to use a really powerful torque wrench because sometimes the settings for them in the low numbers just isn't very accurate and you could over tighten them. Same thing with these wheel bearing and races. I'm just tapping them in using the old race and then finishing it with a race driver, and just take your time. Go nice and slow. Make sure it's going in even. If it's not, you can hit it out and start over. But once you get that race driver in there, it's pretty easy. You just make sure it's sitting down all the way flush and you're good to go. So this is an example of using too much RTV on here. This is the one I like to use for high torque applications, but it was cut a little bit too big from a previous job and I just went with it. But yeah, this is too much. I'd try to use a lot less. So when I pulled the hub off and the spindle, there was a lot of rust in there, and you know, the things just didn't want to come apart. So I put a little bit more grease in there than I normally do. Then sliding on this caliper bracket and then the spindle over it, because it has that RTV on it, what I decided to do was just put it on and let it cure for about an hour after the bolts were finger tight. And then once that hour had elapsed, it was time to go torque it down. So because of that, I kind of skip around a little bit. I do that with RTV now. I like to let these build up a little bit of a skin on them before I torque them down. After they are torqued down, I still wait 24 hours before using it. So that's just the way I do it. So now on to the most important bearing, in my opinion. This is the wheel bearings, and you can see I'm doing both sides, finishing it off with a bunch on the top, making sure I'm going back with the race that this bearing came out of. And I like to do the inside wheel bearing first because that one has a seal that's going to go on it. So after doing this one for the outside, I just set it to the side, make sure it's not going to get any dirt on it. And then get this seal in there, tap it in using an old race once again. These are pretty easy to put in there, so definitely don't crush that up. And then it's time to get the spindle ready for the hub. So I just put a fair amount of grease on there and then nice and easy slide this hub on. Now it's not going to go very far until you start pressing it on. So get it on as far as you can, get that next clean bearing on the outer side, and then you throw the washer on. This only goes one way, so it's got a little key in it. It's pretty easy to do. And then you start putting that first axle nut on there. Using the big socket once again, we're going to get this thing torqued down, and while I'm tightening it, I'm just kind of checking the hub for movement. After you torque it down, you loosen it so it's hand tight, and then now we got to torque it down a second time, which is only 10 pounds. So I use my small torque wrench here to make sure I'm not going to overdo that, and then just make sure it's spinning freely again. So we put the lock washer on there and then torque down the second nut. Now it's time to bend the tabs on that lock washer, one each way, to make sure those nuts aren't going to spin, and you're golden. So now that RTV on the bracket for the spindle and the caliper is dried up, so it's time to torque that down. After that, we're throwing this gasket on for the hub. These gaskets, I mean, they seem to have worked in the past, but the one for my outside hub where the selector is, it must have let some water in, so I tried something new. I decided to go with RTV this time, and you know, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but I've had good luck with RTV in the past, so I'm giving it a shot. You can see that axle clip there. That took a while to get on there, and it can be very frustrating, but you know, just take your time, step away when you need to. Here's that RTV I was talking about. Try to put a very small amount on, but like I said, the key is not getting any axle grease on there. And because it's RTV, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put these bolts on, I'm going to tighten them down to finger tight, and then I'm going to let it cure for an hour. Then I torque it down, and then I don't use it for 24 hours. So just my process. While we're waiting for all that to dry, I'm throwing some axle grease on the knuckle ball because we're going to have that seal on there. And when you assemble these, this is key. Some people say water pump studs. This is just a bolt that I cut the head off, and without these, this is a nightmare. I hate this part. But even with these studs, it's not easy, but the studs help out a lot, and once you get everything aligned, it kind of just comes together and you sandwich this all in. But like a lot of Samurai stuff, do not over torque these. These are a really low torque rating, And you know, you just need them to sit evenly on there, nice and flush, and make sure you have the same amount of that pad all the way around. Doing this right goes a long way, so that way you don't have anything leaking out and you don't have anything leaking in. Now I'm kind of trimming up some of that RTV because I put way too much on, like I said earlier. Now I'm putting on the bracket that holds on the brake caliper and the high steer arm, and when I undid it, they were loose. So I decided to throw some Loctite on, and then I also went up about 10 pounds in the torque on them, just because I felt like I don't want that to come loose. Now that I have hydraulic assist, I have a lot more stress on those, so a little bit more for me. Another tip I picked up on the way is throwing some anti-seize on this part of your tie rod end. I found that this helps to get these out later because there's a lot of pressure holding these on because they are kind of a beveled edge to it. And same with the castle nuts. There's no reason to crank down on those. I mean, it's fairly tight. I just make sure I can see a full circle for the cotter pin to go through, and then I throw it on. All right, so now we're finishing the torque on that high steer arm. It's time to put everything back on. This last part I don't show. It's just torquing down those 6 bolts that are holding the hub cap right there. And yeah, it's a low setting, so go easy on it and just make sure you get it right. Once we torque that passenger wheel down, we are done with that side. So it's kind of hard to tell in that video because everything's just moving so fast, and some of it wasn't really zoomed in. We had some damaged parts inside that front axle for sure. And I think for the most part, it's probably normal wear and tear for wheeling around a little Samurai axle that's now on 33s. It really was the bearings that were starting to fail. The wheel bearings on my driver's side were kind of just rusted out. Some water got in there at one point, and those were starting to fail. The trunnion bearings weren't doing great either, so I'm really glad I opened it up. And now I know if I'm going to wheel this axle more and put off that Toyota upgrade, this is something we're going to have to do every year. It just has to be done because it's better to find these things in the garage than on the trail, holding yourself and everybody else up. Glad we did this. Don't forget to do yours. Really easy. I'll see what parts I can include and put them down in the description if you guys think that'll be a help for you. And yeah, if you have any questions, just throw them down in the comments. I'll help you out with whatever I can. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.